Did you think reaching your golden years was tough? What if surviving to old age meant facing a world where pain was constant and help was scarce? What if life past 40 was a truly terrifying prospect? These were the brutal truths of growing old in medieval times. Number 7. The unlikelihood of even reaching old age. Imagine a time when the average life expectancy for a person born was around 30 to 40 years. This number might sound impossibly low, but it tells a stark story of a world where merely surviving childhood was a monumental achievement. Most people never experienced what we would call old age at all. A vast portion of the population perished before their 5th birthday, succumbing to illnesses that modern medicine easily conquers. Measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox. These were not minor inconveniences, but potential death sentences for infants and young children. A study of grave markers from the 14th century, for example, shows a steep drop in mortality after infancy, but still a significant number of deaths before the age of 10, as documented in historical demographic research on medieval populations. Beyond the perilous early years, other threats constantly loomed, ready to snatch away lives before they reached maturity or even middle age. Famine was a recurring specter across Europe. Crop failures, due to bad weather, pests, or warfare, could plunge entire regions into starvation. When food supplies dwindled, the young and the old were often the first to suffer, their bodies too weak to withstand prolonged periods of hunger. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, wiped out an estimated 10 to 25% of the population in some areas, affecting all ages but leaving the most vulnerable with little chance of recovery. Accounts from chroniclers like Jean Froissart detail the widespread suffering and death that accompanied such agricultural catastrophes, underscoring the precariousness of life. Warfare also decimated populations without discrimination. While battlefields claimed many young men, the broader consequences of conflict destroyed crops, looted villages, and the spread of disease by marching armies impacted everyone. Women, children, and the elderly were caught in the crossfire, victims of displacement, violence, or the subsequent deprivation. For example, during the 100 Years' War, English chevauchés, or raiding expeditions, deliberately targeted agricultural lands and civilian settlements, leading to widespread death from starvation and exposure. As noted in the historical analyses of military campaigns of that era, survival was a daily gamble. Then came the Black Death. This devastating plague, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, stands as the ultimate testament to the fragility of life. It annihilated an estimated 30 to 50% of the European population in just a few years. The plague made no exceptions based on age. Entire families could be wiped out. While some sources suggest the very old and very young were more susceptible, the disease's virulence meant few were truly safe. The English chronicler, Henry Knighton, described villages left entirely empty, a grim testament to the plague's indiscriminate reach. If you managed to live past the Black Death, you had already overcome a hurdle of unimaginable scale. Childbirth was another significant killer of young women. Many women did not survive their reproductive years, meaning fewer mothers were available to nurture their children into adulthood and fewer potential caregivers for their own aging parents. High maternal mortality rates were a constant feature of medieval society, with risks including infection, hemorrhage, and eclampsia. Records from manorial courts occasionally mention cases where a woman died during or immediately after childbirth, leaving behind young children and a grieving family. The absence of antiseptic practices and effective medical intervention made every birth a life or death situation for the mother. Accidents, though less catastrophic than famine or plague, were also common dangers. A simple fall, a wound from a farm tool, or an animal attack could easily lead to fatal infection in a world without antibiotics. A farmer might injure his leg with a scythe, and what would now be a minor incident could quickly fester, leading to blood poisoning and death. A woman could fall into a well while drawing water. A child could be trampled by livestock. These everyday hazards contributed to the overall low life expectancy. The dangers of daily work were immense, turning mundane tasks into potential death traps for people of all ages, but particularly the young and the old. What this meant for the concept of old age was profound. An elderly person, in medieval times perhaps, someone who had reached their 50s or 60s, was a rarity, a survivor against incredible odds. They had likely endured multiple famines, witnessed devastating plagues, and buried many family members and friends. Their very existence was a testament to immense physical resilience and a measure of luck. Such individuals were a small fraction of the population, often less than 10% of the total, as indicated by analyses of medieval census data and demographic models. The world was a place designed for the young and the strong, with little room for the frail or infirm. Living to what we consider middle age today was a feat, and true old age was a privilege few experienced. Number 6. The unyielding grip of physical decline. For those rare individuals who did manage to escape the many early deaths of medieval life and reach what was considered old age, a new set of brutal realities awaited them. Their bodies, unlike those of their modern counterparts, had been subjected to a lifetime of relentless physical toil and extreme hardship. This constant strain took a heavy toll, often leading to severe and debilitating physical decline long before modern markers of old age. Arthritis. A common complaint today was an epidemic of agony in the medieval period. Farmers spent their days bending, lifting, and pushing their joints, grinding under the stress of manual labor. A peasant woman would have spent countless hours kneeling to weed fields, grinding grain, carrying heavy loads of water or firewood, and spinning wool, all of which would have worn down her knees, hips, and back. Skeletal remains from medieval burial sites often reveal widespread evidence of degenerative joint diseases, reflecting the harsh physical demands placed on the body from a young age. Chronic pain was not an occasional ache, but a constant companion. There were no anti-inflammatory drugs, no physical therapy, no joint replacement surgeries to ease the suffering. A bad back, sustained from years of plowing or hauling, meant endless discomfort. A blacksmith, his body hammered by years at the anvil, might find his hands twisted and useless, unable to grip his tools. Tooth loss was also incredibly common, not just from poor hygiene, but from a diet often coarse and abrasive, full of grit from stone-ground flour. Imagine trying to eat with few or no teeth, making digestion difficult and leading to further nutritional deficiencies. The absence of dentists meant that a toothache could spiral into a life-threatening infection. A medieval person's diet, while providing necessary calories for demanding work, often lacked essential vitamins and minerals. This led to brittle bones, weak muscles, and compromised immune system. Years of insufficient vitamin D, for example, could contribute to osteoporosis, making falls incredibly dangerous. Nutritional deficiencies were not just about feeling tired. They actively accelerated the aging process and reduced the body's ability to repair itself. A peasant relying primarily on coarse grains and root vegetables might develop deficiencies that impacted their vision, leading to early cataracts, or weaken their bones, making them more susceptible to fractures. The relentless exposure to the elements also contributed to premature aging. Farmers, fisherfolk, and laborers spent their lives outdoors, enduring harsh sun, bitter cold, and driving rain with minimal protection. Their skin would have been weathered and aged, their bodies constantly battling the elements. The wear and tear on their bodies was evident in their physical appearance. A person in their 40s or 50s in medieval times might physically resemble someone much older by today's standards. They would likely be stooped from years of labor, their faces deeply lined, and their bodies carrying the scars of a hard life. A medieval portrait or illuminated manuscript often depicts older people with deep wrinkles and a frail posture, reflecting this reality. Sensory decline added another layer of difficulty. Vision often deteriorated significantly with age, making tasks like spinning, weaving, or reading for the literate few increasingly difficult or impossible. Imagine a seamstress whose eyesight begins to fail, preventing her from earning her living. Hearing loss was also common, perhaps from untreated ear infections or exposure to loud environments like blacksmith forges or bustling markets. Losing these senses meant a person became more dependent, less able to participate in daily activities, and more vulnerable to accidents. A deaf old man might struggle to communicate with his family, leading to isolation. The cumulative effect of this physical deterioration was a profound impact on an individual's ability to function and contribute to society. If a farmer could no longer work his land, his family's survival was imperiled. If a craftsperson could no longer practice their trade, their income ceased. Without the ability to perform physical tasks, an elderly person often became a burden. Their perceived value diminished. Their physical condition determined their ability to earn a living, to care for themselves, and to participate fully in community life. A report from a 13th century manorial survey might note that an elderly tenant was infirm and unable to work, indicating a change in their social standing and economic prospects. Their bodies, once strong tools for survival, became sources of constant pain and limitation, making old age a period defined by increasing fragility and dependence. Number 5. The terrifying absence of modern medical care. The physical decline experienced by the elderly in medieval times was made infinitely worse by the terrifyingly rudimentary state of medical knowledge and care. The understanding of disease was rooted in ancient Greek theories, primarily the humoral theory, which posited that the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and an imbalance of these caused illness. This belief system led to treatments that often harmed more than they helped. For example, bloodletting, the practice of opening a vein to drain blood, was a common remedy for a vast array of ailments, from fevers to headaches, often weakening an already frail patient. Similarly, purging through induced vomiting or laxatives was believed to rid the body of excess humors, further dehydrating and debilitating the sick. These practices, while common, were not based on empirical evidence, but on theoretical frameworks, as described in medical treatises of the period. Beyond these theoretical treatments, many believed illness was a divine punishment for sins, or the work of demonic forces. This perspective meant that prayer, penance, and seeking miraculous cures at shrines were often as important as any physical intervention. A sick, elderly person might spend their meager resources on a pilgrimage to a saint's shrine or on purchasing an indulgence rather than seeking the help of a local healer. The spiritual dimension of sickness was paramount, often overshadowing any practical medical approach. Chronicles often mention miraculous cures attributed to saints rather than to medical practitioners, highlighting the prevalent belief in divine intervention. The healers themselves varied wildly in skill and knowledge. While some barber surgeons could perform basic amputations or set broken bones, their methods were brutal. Surgery was an excruciating ordeal, conducted without anesthesia beyond perhaps a strong alcoholic drink or a dose of opium, if available, to dull the senses but not to eliminate pain. Infections post-surgery were rampant, as the concept of hygiene was unknown. Surgeons worked with unsterilized tools, and often on dirty surfaces, unknowingly introducing bacteria into open wounds. Many patients who survived the initial operation succumbed to sepsis days or weeks later. Medieval medical texts, such as those by John Ardern, a renowned surgeon of the 14th century, demonstrate some empirical observation, but still lack the understanding of germ theory. Herbal remedies were the most common form of treatment, often prepared by village-wise women, monks, or apothecaries. While some herbs did possess genuine medicinal properties, their dosages were imprecise, and their effectiveness was often overshadowed by superstition or a lack of understanding of complex physiological. A potion for a stomach ailment might contain ingredients that had some benefit, but also others that were inert or even toxic. The effectiveness of remedies was more hit or miss, and a person with a severe illness, particularly a chronic one, might receive little lasting relief. For someone suffering from chronic pain, the available remedies offered only temporary respite, if any. For the vast majority of the population, access to formal medical care was limited. Monasteries often had infirmaries that provided basic care for their monks, and sometimes for the local poor. But these were few and far between. Hospitals, as they existed, were often more akin to hospices or charitable institutions, providing food and shelter rather than sophisticated medical treatment. They were places for the sick to die with dignity rather than to be cured. A sick elderly person in a rural village might rely entirely on their family or a local healer whose knowledge was passed down through generations rather than learned through formal training. Pain management beyond a few basic herbal sedatives was virtually non-existent. For an elderly person suffering from severe arthritis, chronic toothaches, or the lingering effects of old injuries, every day was a battle against unyielding pain. There were no effective painkillers, no modern anti-inflammatory drugs. A bad tooth might fester for weeks or months, leading to excruciating pain and eventually systemic infection. This constant physical suffering would have worn down even the strongest spirits, leaving little room for comfort or peace in their later years. The constant background hum of physical discomfort was a defining feature of old age for many. Furthermore, the medieval world was rife with quackery and charlatans, individuals who preyed on the desperation of the sick with false promises of miraculous cures or magical concoctions. Vulnerable elderly people desperate for relief might easily fall victim to these schemes, spending their last pennies on useless elixirs. Without any regulatory bodies or scientific method to vet claims, distinguishing legitimate, if limited, healers from outright frauds was difficult for the uneducated populace. The lack of effective medical knowledge meant that an elderly person often faced their final illnesses with little hope of recovery, enduring immense suffering with only the comfort of faith or the limited compassion of their loved ones. Death was not a peaceful passing, but often a protracted, agonizing battle with illness, unwinnable in the absence of true medical understanding. Number 4. The crushing weight of economic hardship. For those who miraculously survived the dangers of early life and the ravages of physical decay, a different kind of terror often emerged in their later years: profound economic hardship. In a society where wealth was primarily tied to land and manual labor, the inability to work meant a direct and often immediate loss of income and status. For the vast majority of medieval people, who were peasants or common laborers, their physical strength was their primary asset. A farmer who could no longer plow his fields, sow his seeds, or tend his livestock became economically unproductive. A craftsman whose hands shook with age or whose eyesight failed could no longer weave, carve, or forge. This cessation of work meant an immediate plunge into poverty, with no social safety nets like pensions or unemployment benefits to cushion the fall. The medieval family unit was often the primary source of support for the elderly, but this came with significant strains. An elderly parent who could no longer contribute physically became a burden on their children, especially if the family was already struggling to subsist. In a world where families lived on the edge of survival, an extra mouth to feed, especially one that could not earn its keep, put immense pressure on household resources. Stories from court records or manorial documents sometimes describe disputes over the care of elderly parents, indicating the difficult choices families faced. While some children honored their parents and provided care, others might resent the additional strain, leading to difficult domestic situations. Land ownership or tenancy was a critical factor. For a peasant, the right to work a specific piece of land was their livelihood. If an elderly tenant became too infirm to cultivate their holding, they risked losing their tenancy. Manorial lords sometimes had provisions for elderly tenants to retire and pass on their tenancy to a son in exchange for a small pension in kind, like a few bushels of grain or a place by the fire. However, these arrangements were often precarious, dependent on the goodwill of the lord or the son, and could be revoked. If no son was available or willing, the elderly person might face eviction and complete destitution. The very structure of feudal society meant that security was tied to active participation in the land economy, leaving the non-productive elderly highly vulnerable. Charity from the church or wealthy individuals provided some meager relief, but it was rarely enough to live on. Monasteries distributed alms to the poor, and some wealthy patrons endowed almshouses, institutions that provided basic shelter and food for a small number of the destitute elderly. However, these provisions were limited and often reserved for those who had lived upright, devout lives. Competition for these spots would have been fierce. A person might spend years begging for a place in an almshouse, as described in some urban historical accounts of the poor. The shame associated with accepting charity was also a heavy burden, for many a stark contrast to a lifetime of independence. For those with no family support or access to charitable institutions, begging was often the only option. An elderly person, perhaps crippled by arthritis or blind, might be seen on the streets of a town, holding out a hand for alms. This was a life of profound humiliation and constant hunger. They relied entirely on the sporadic kindness of strangers, often facing indifference or disdain. This was a far cry from the respect that might have been accorded to them in their youth, when they were productive members of society. Their economic destitution often stripped them of their dignity. The transition from a life of active labor to one of dependency was not just an economic shift. It was a profound social and psychological one. The elderly lost their autonomy, their ability to make choices about their own lives. They were at the mercy of others, their children, their lord, or the charity of strangers. This loss of control was deeply disempowering. A master craftsman who had once commanded respect in his guild might find himself reduced to living on the fringes, his skills no longer valued because his body could no longer perform them. The economic reality of medieval old age was a relentless struggle for basic survival, often accompanied by a profound sense of uselessness and shame. Number 3. The shifting sands of social status and respect. The notion that medieval society automatically revered its elders as fonts of wisdom and experience is largely a romanticized myth. While proverbs and religious teachings sometimes espoused respect for the aged, the lived reality was far more complex and often far harsher. An individual's social status in old age was not a fixed point. Rather, it shifted dramatically based on their continued utility, their wealth, and their physical capabilities. For many, growing old meant a gradual, sometimes brutal erosion of their standing in the community and even within their own family. The idealized image of the wise elder dispensing sagely advice was most often reserved for those who could afford to be wise: the wealthy abbots, the landed gentry, or the seasoned master craftsmen who had accumulated property, or held positions of authority. A rich lord, even in his declining years, retained his power and prestige because his wealth and lineage guaranteed his continued influence. He could employ servants, hire skilled medical practitioners, and live comfortably without needing to perform physical labor. His respect was tied to his material possessions and inherited status, not necessarily his continued physical vigor. For the vast majority of people, however, respect was directly linked to their ability to contribute. An elderly man who could no longer work his land or participate in communal hunts might find his voice in village discussions diminished. His sons, now the primary providers, might make decisions without his consultation. His loss of physical capacity often translated into a loss of agency. He might still hold the title of head of household, but the actual power dynamic would have shifted dramatically. Historical accounts from village life sometimes hint at tensions within families when an elder clung to authority despite their diminishing capacity. Elderly women faced their own unique challenges. While some might gain a certain status as wise women or midwives, particularly if they possessed knowledge of herbs or healing, many others became economically dependent. Without a husband to support them, or if their children were unable or unwilling to provide for them, they often became household servants in their own children's homes, or took on menial tasks like spinning wool or tending children for a pittance. Their perceived value often lay in their ability to perform domestic chores, not necessarily in their wisdom or experience. The term crone, now a negative word, originally referred to an old woman but eventually acquired negative connotations of ugliness and uselessness, reflecting a societal shift. The perception of the elderly could swing between reverence and suspicion. While some might look to an elder for advice on farming techniques or local history, others might view them with suspicion, especially if they were seen as a burden. Folk beliefs sometimes associated older women, particularly those living alone, with witchcraft or ill omens, leading to ostracism rather than respect. An old, isolated woman might become the target of blame for misfortunes in the village, a scapegoat for anxieties about the unknown. This was a dark reality for some of the most vulnerable members of society. Public humiliation was not uncommon for those who had lost their economic footing. An elderly person forced to beg in public, for instance, was a visible symbol of their reduced status. They were often treated with a mixture of pity and disdain. Their former standing, whatever it might have been, was often forgotten in their destitution. The medieval period, while sometimes romanticized as a time of close-knit communities, could also be incredibly harsh towards those who could not pull their own weight. In essence, while medieval society had an ideal of respecting elders, the reality was often far grittier. Respect was often conditional, based on a person's continued ability to contribute economically, maintain their health, or retain their wealth. For the vast majority, old age meant a decline not just in physical strength, but often in social standing, dignity, and autonomy. The shifting sands of social status meant that what little respect an elder held could easily be washed away by the tide of infirmity and poverty, leaving them exposed and vulnerable in the harsh glare of medieval life. Number 2. The bleak landscape of isolation and loneliness. Surviving into old age in medieval times often meant confronting a deeply personal and emotionally crippling reality: profound isolation and loneliness. This was not the quiet solitude of choice, but a harsh consequence of a world defined by high mortality rates, limited mobility, and often strained familial bonds. For many, their later years were marked by a dwindling circle of loved ones, leaving them adrift in a world that offered little comfort or companionship. The most immediate and devastating cause of isolation was the constant presence of death. By the time a person reached their 50s or 60s, they would have likely buried most, if not all, of their immediate family. Spouses often died young, leaving the surviving partner to navigate life alone. Children too frequently succumbed to disease or accident before their parents. The Black Death, for example, could wipe out entire family lines, leaving survivors with no close relatives whatsoever. Imagine living through such a plague only to find yourself the last one standing surrounded by ghosts and empty houses. The emotional toll of such pervasive loss would have been immense, a constant companion to their own aging process. Beyond the loss of family, close friends and neighbors also vanished with alarming frequency. People lived in smaller, often more isolated communities, meaning their social network was typically confined to their immediate village or manor. If a friend moved away for work or died of illness, replacing that connection was difficult. The medieval world lacked the widespread communication and transportation networks that allow modern individuals to maintain relationships across distances. A journey to a neighboring village might be a day-long undertaking on foot, making regular visits for the elderly nearly impossible if they were infirm. Their world shrank to the confines of their immediate dwelling, and whatever small interactions they could manage within their limited sphere. Even within their own household, an elderly person might experience a chilling form of emotional distance. If they became a financial or physical burden, their children might grow resentful. While duty compelled care, affection was not always guaranteed. A daughter-in-law or son might find the extra labor of caring for an ailing parent overwhelming, leading to a strained atmosphere in the home. An elderly person might feel they were an imposition, leading them to withdraw further, contributing to their own sense of loneliness. The lack of privacy in cramped medieval homes meant that emotional tensions were often close to the surface, leaving little room for quiet dignity or personal space for the aged. For those without living family, monastic life offered a potential refuge, but it was not widely accessible. Only a select few could afford to enter a monastery or convent, often requiring a donation or a dowry. For the vast majority of the poor and uneducated, this option was out of reach. They were left to fend for themselves, relying on the tenuous bonds of community or the often insufficient charity of the church. Without a strong family unit, an elderly person could easily fall through the cracks, becoming a solitary figure on the margins of society. The psychological impact of this pervasive loneliness was almost certainly severe, though medieval texts rarely address mental health in the way we understand it today. Depression, despair, and a pervasive sense of abandonment would have been common, yet unrecognized and untreated. There were no therapists, no support groups, no understanding of clinical depression. An elderly person might simply be seen as melancholy or feeble-minded, their emotional suffering dismissed or attributed to spiritual failings. They were left to bear their sorrow alone, without recognition or relief. The village community, while sometimes portrayed as a supportive network, was not always a haven. If an elderly person was perceived as unproductive, senile, or simply odd, they might face ostracism or ridicule. Their decline in mental faculties, which might be due to dementia, could be misunderstood as madness or even possession, leading to fear and avoidance from their neighbors. This could exacerbate their isolation, making them feel like outcasts in their own homes or villages. The bleak landscape of loneliness in medieval old age was a silent suffering, a deep personal battle fought without the comfort of companionship or the solace of understanding. Number 1. The looming shadow of spiritual dread. Beyond the physical ailments, economic hardship, and profound loneliness, the most pervasive and terrifying reality for many growing old in medieval times was the overwhelming shadow of spiritual dread. Life was seen as a brief perilous journey towards an eternal destiny, and old age brought the terrifying prospect of imminent judgment. The church wielded immense power over the minds of the populace, shaping their will-do from cradle to grave. For the elderly, this meant a heightened focus on salvation, damnation, and the agonizing purgatory that awaited most souls. The fear of dying unshriven without receiving the last rites was perhaps the greatest anxiety. Confession was paramount, a cleansing of sins before facing God. If a person died suddenly, perhaps in an accident or from a swift illness, without confessing their sins and receiving absolution from a priest, their soul was believed to be in grave peril, condemned to eternal torment. This fear meant that even a minor illness could trigger immense spiritual anxiety, as the elderly person worried about their readiness to meet their Maker. Chronicles often detail the frantic efforts of families to summon a priest for the dying, emphasizing the urgent need for final rites. Sickness and suffering in old age were often interpreted through a deeply religious lens. They were seen not merely as physical ailments, but as divine tests, punishments for past sins or opportunities for spiritual purification. An elderly person enduring chronic pain might believe they were expiating their transgressions, a concept that offered a form of grim comfort, but also added a layer of profound guilt and fear to their suffering. This belief system encouraged passive acceptance of pain as a path to salvation, rather than a drive to seek relief. Sermons and religious texts of the time frequently exhorted the faithful to endure suffering patiently, viewing it as a spiritual exercise. Preparation for death consumed much of an elderly person's later thoughts and actions. Making a will, if they had any property, was not just about distributing possessions, but often included specific instructions for masses to be said for their soul after their death. These endowments were believed to shorten their time in purgatory, a concept that gained immense popularity in the later medieval period. Wealthier individuals might endow an entire chantry chapel, where priests would continuously pray for their soul. For the poor, even a small donation to the church or a request for a few prayers was a significant act of spiritual insurance. The emphasis on pilgrimage, veneration of relics, and the purchase of indulgences also intensified in old age. Pilgrimages, often arduous journeys, were undertaken to seek divine intervention for healing, or, more commonly, to accumulate spiritual merit. An elderly person might embark on a final difficult pilgrimage to a popular shrine, believing it would cleanse their sins and improve their chances of salvation. Relics, fragments of saints' bodies or possessions, were believed to possess miraculous powers and were sought out for their spiritual efficacy. Indulgences, granted by the church in exchange for charitable acts or donations, were believed to reduce the time spent in purgatory, becoming a crucial component of spiritual planning for the dying. The omnipresent reminders of death in medieval society further fueled this spiritual dread. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, a popular artistic motif of the period, depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, priests, and children, in a macabre dance, reminding everyone that death was inevitable and indiscriminate. Graveyards were often in the center of villages, and death rituals were public spectacles. These constant visual and cultural reminders ensured that mortality was always on the mind, particularly for the elderly who knew their time was short. The concept of memento mori, Latin for "remember you must die," was not a philosophical exercise, but a daily reality, particularly as one's body began to fail. The Church, while offering comfort through sacraments and community, also exerted immense control through the propagation of fear of damnation. For an elderly person, the weight of a lifetime of unconfessed or unforgiven sins could become unbearable. The teachings about hell, depicted in vivid and terrifying imagery in sermons and stained glass, would have fueled intense anxiety about their eternal fate. Old age, therefore, was not a time of peaceful reflection, but often a period of heightened spiritual terror, a desperate scramble to secure one's salvation before time ran out. The looming shadow of judgment and the unknown horrors of the afterlife were perhaps the harshest burdens for the medieval elderly to bear. A fear that transcended physical pain or worldly poverty,